Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. This is the second and final part of my interview with Amie Thomasson. In part one, Professor Thomasson gave a brief summary of the recent history of ontology and explained her own approach to ontology. In this second part, she addresses objections and contrasts her theory with competing alternatives. I strongly recommend you listen to part one before this part. You can find it, as always, at williamnava.com. One issue that you tackle in your book, like a kind of potential objection, is one of circularity. And I wonder if that might be on people's mind. I remember it did occur to me first when I was reading your book. And that is, if you say, well, there are particles arranged desk-wise, and that's obvious from observation, and from that we begin this inference that leads to us accepting that there is a desk. By saying desk-wise, aren't you kind of presupposing something? So that I think that's one way I think you could formulate the circularity concern. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of address that possibility that you might always have to sort of presuppose something that's actually a bit of begging the question?
Yeah, I guess you have to distinguish whether you are presupposing the usability and meaningfulness of a concept or presupposing the truth that you're trying to prove, right? So in speaking of particles arranged desk-wise, right, this is a terminology that wasn't introduced by me. This was introduced by the foes of desks, right? By Peter Van Wagen, I believe, was the first to use it.
Interesting. Okay.
And it was, I think it's plausible to say that the way of conceptually getting a grip on what it is to be arranged desk-wise is parasitic on having the concept of a desk, right? That's arguable. I don't really want to take a stand on it, but I think it's plausible. So he says something like those particles arranged in such a way that they have all those features that we normally think it would take for there to be a desk. So not just the spatiotemporal structure, but also the cultural and social features. Maybe you could, in principle, state all of those without using the word desk. Maybe you could introduce someone to them who didn't have our language and concept of desk. I don't know. If you can't, right, then if anything, that's kind of more awkward for my opponents. But now take the question, are there desks, right, the ontological question. Well, obviously, to answer that question, we have to possess the concept of a desk, right? If you have to possess the concept of a desk also to understand what arranged desk-wise is, that's fine, right? But what that doesn't tell you is if any particles actually are ever arranged desk-wise. You've got to go out and look around. It's not very hard, but to find out, right? You go into an office building or something, and then you can see, oh, look, there's particles arranged desk-wise. Then you can answer the existence questions. So I think whatever presupposition there is here, it's a conceptual presupposition that to get the concept of arranged desk-wise, you have to have the concept of desk. But in neither case does possession of this concept tell you that it's fulfilled, that there is something, there are particles that are arranged desk-wise. You got to go look at the world for that.
Just as there presumably is the property of particles being arranged unicorn-wise, even though they may never be instantiated.
Perfect. Exactly right. Yeah. So you can get the concept of what it is to be a unicorn or to have particles arranged unicorn-wise, but you still got to check the world to see if either of those properties is instantiated. Yeah. If either of those concepts has a referent.
So I now want to focus in on I think that the first impression that most people would have listening to this is that this is too easy. We must be in some way avoiding the problem. And I think that the intuition toward that view might be something like, what we're doing is kind of linguistic playing around, right? We're making these inferences based on rules of use. And so we're engaged in a kind of linguistic endeavor. And so the intuition might be, you're trying to answer all this by sort of analyzing things linguistically, but these questions are supposed to be real questions about what the world really is like, right? Like there either is or is not a property of being a desk or whiteness or whatever. And certainly to discover something about the world itself can't just be as easy as analyzing how we use words. What is your kind of response to that sort of concern?
So I think in answering these kinds of existence questions, we are answering typically questions about the world. But in answering questions about the world, they have to be formulated using language. And those who say, oh no, we only want to look at the world, not at our language, let's not get sidetracked in language, I think are naively overlooking that fact, that in answering and asking questions, we've got to be using words. And for these questions to be meaningful and answerable, these words have to have meanings. Right? And all I'm really doing, I think, is highlighting the fact that once you have these kinds of meanings in place, we are answering these existence questions in the only sense these terms have. So in the empirical case, right, as we were just talking about, right, to answer the question, are there desks or are there unicorns, you have to know what desk and unicorn mean, but then you also have to look to the world and see if there is anything that's kind of its own species that's sort of horse-like but has one horn and so on, or if there's a table-like structure made for writing on and used in company and offices or whatever the right definition is. So those really are answered by looking to the world. I think the feeling that it's merely a linguistic trick arises less for those that are answerable empirically than for those that can be derived from, you can get an answer to, from a conceptual truth. So questions about the existence of properties or numbers, right? You can get maybe from there are 2 pens on my desk or there aren't. You can equally well derive the conclusion, and so the number of pens on my desk is or is not 2, and so there's a number, namely 2, right? And that feels more like a trick of language, I think, to a lot of people. Maybe same for property talk. If you think you can get from the dog is or it isn't white to there's a property of whiteness that the dog does or does not possess, to there's a property, again, that seems more like a trick and less worldly because you can derive the existence of properties or numbers regardless of how the world is, right? But again, I think the key here is to notice that, at least if I'm right, and there's plenty of room for argument about how these terms work, but if I'm right that these are the inferential rules these terms follow, look, what you're concluding is that there are properties and there are numbers in the only sense these words have. That's all it is for there to be a property or a number. And then you can put pressure on your opponents to say, you thought there's something else that would take for there to really be a number or a property? Tell me more. What is that? What exactly were you expecting? Were you expecting some cupcake-like object floating around in Plato's heaven to be required for the form of whiteness? Hey, maybe your expectations were just too inflated. But all it takes really is we can make these kinds of inferences, and we can figure out about those by paying attention to how our terminology works, and also to the functions for which it was introduced, which we can talk about more if that's the way you want to go.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? I think if you want to find out if anything holds, then you have to kind of ask, okay, well, what does the thing that I'm investigating mean? And then look at the world. Does it match? If yes, then yes. If no, then no. And there really can't be anything else to it since we're using language to ask the question in the first place, and we have to. And so we can't really get around that. What we're asking about are the meanings of the things we're talking about, and it can't be anything sort of more than that.
Yeah, or at least we have to start by a grasp of these meanings in order to go on and meaningfully ask these questions. And then sometimes it's very straightforward once you got straight about the meaning. Yeah. Yeah,
and I think that I love the way that you put it, because I think that you're right that the sense that that this is too easy may come from the sense that there should have been more to, if we're going to say, yes, the number 2 exists, then there must have been more to it than just the way our language is set up and the way that the world is leads us to have to admit that it exists. There has to be more to it than that. But I think you're totally right that in a way that sense maybe comes from the sort of historical backdrop of a more substantial kind of Platonism, where we kind of expect that there must be some kind of like ethereal existence to these things.
Yeah. So here's another relation to that I want to bring out, which is it also comes to this assumption, I think, that our talk of numbers is like our talk of birds. Right? So we think of our talk of birds as introduced to track some real things in the world. So you see these little things flying about. You want to be able to talk about them and ask what's eating your crops or whatever. So we can introduce some terminology. And our use of the term bird is explained by its causal relationship to these things out there in the world, the birds. And the function of the term bird is to enable us to track these things and make predictions about them and follow their movements, whatever it is, right? If you start by thinking of our talk of numbers like that, then you'll naturally be led to a kind of traditional Platonist view that thinks, oh, our talk of numbers must be referring to these special little things out in Plato's heaven, but what could those be? We couldn't come into causal contact with them, so how could we ever know them? And you get all the classical puzzles. One way to dissolve all those kinds of worries and traditional puzzles is to say, hang on, the mistake began a ways back when you assumed that the function of our number talk is like the function of our bird talk. Maybe number talk has a different function, and Steve Yablo has a beautiful story about this, though he's not an easy ontologist. But look, maybe we introduce noun terms for numbers. Instead of just saying there are 2 cups on the table, to say the number of cups is 2. For a totally different purpose. We're not trying to track numbers. What we're trying to do is to be able to state certain kinds of generalizations that we couldn't otherwise. If we want to state generalizations of scientific laws, for example, there are some that, if you don't have noun terms for numbers, it takes an infinite series of infinitely long sentences to state them. But if you can talk about the ratio of the number of x's to the number of y's and so on, right, rather than having to enter each instance, you can say it really briefly. So if the function of number talk is to simplify our ways of calculating and communicating in certain forms, not to track things out there, then we don't have to think of it on a traditional Platonist model that imagines there to be a special range of objects but we're not in causal contact with them. So in a lot of these cases, the easy ontological view is really nicely connected to a kind of pragmatist view about language that says, hang on, our different kinds of terms, our property terms, our math terms, maybe our moral terms, maybe our modal terms, have really different functions than our terms that are designed to track ordinary objects. And it's because of false analogies with the sort of tracking language that we're led astray into thinking there would have to be something more for there to really be numbers or necessities or moral properties or whatever. And once you get back to understanding the function of the language and understanding the rules it follows, you won't have those kinds of expectations anymore.
Yeah. Or if you're thinking about it in terms of, let's say, the property of whiteness, we presumably didn't introduce the property of whiteness because we were seeing, the property itself, and we were like, oh, let's talk about that. But we were seeing it instantiated. We were seeing sort of white things, and we wanted to be able to talk about the similarities of those things and their relationships and things like that. And so that just made it very convenient to introduce into this framework where we can then talk about the property of whiteness. But
exactly.
It was not a kind of substantial thing that we were tracking as we might track an object.
Exactly. And that might have some advantages for us. Now we can say the property of whiteness has survival value at night because you can be seen and not be hit or something like that, or anti-survival value because it can be found by predators and eaten, right? And then it has certain uses in our theorizing that would be much more complicated if you just said this is white and that is white and so on. So
there's another view that you discuss in your book that you could say takes a kind of linguistic approach, and that's the quantifier variance approach. Can you talk a little bit about what that quantifier variance view is and how it's sort of how it's different from easy ontology?
Sure. Yeah. So before I started work on easy ontology, quantifier variance was thought of as the big threat to mainstream neo-Quinean metaphysics. And it's a view that was developed by Eli Hirsch. It's also suggested to work of Hilary Putnam's, but it's sort of most fully developed by Hirsch, which says this. Look, the word exists, or there is, if you think of these as interchangeable, has many different, or may have many different meanings. And so, and you can think this in different ways. Putnam thinks it actually has different meanings. Hirsch thinks it could. You can certainly define it in many different, equally good ways, where no understanding of it is privileged. And given that, then, Hirsch thought that a lot of, he doesn't go so far as all, but that a lot of metaphysical debates can be understood as cases in which the disputants are just talking past each other by using exists in different ways. So if one person, and his prime example is mereological sums, a mereological sum is just supposed to be, if you've got anything, A and B, here I've got a cup and a pen, right? Then you can say, there's this mereological sum of cup and pen, right? So Hirsch thinks some philosophers have accepted mereological sums, some have denied them. He says, look, they're just using exists in different senses. And so they're really just talking past each other in not a way entirely different than if I said, I went to the bank today, and you said, no, you didn't, right? And I mean the riverbank, and you mean the financial institution. We're just talking past each other and not really disagreeing, because I'll agree I didn't visit the financial institution, and you can agree that I did visit the riverside. And so ontological disputes on this model turn out to be just verbal disputes where people are talking past each other.
Yeah, so there's something very intuitive about that, which is just that if people do have a different sense of some word, then obviously they are going to differ. And there's a way in which we know that the meanings of words, although this is not actually how they in fact emerge in our use, they can be just stipulated, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think for that reason, that view is very intuitive. So how is your view different, and what motivates you, even though you do take this kind of deflationary and kind of linguistic approach, what motivates you in differing from the quantifier variance view?
Yeah, good. So I'm not really against this view, and I do think it's there. It's available as a possible diagnosis of some debates. There's two reasons I don't take it up. One is that while there are many kinds of verbal disputes and cases in which our word meanings aren't quite lined up, I've never been completely clear about what it would mean specifically for there is or there exists to vary in meaning. Maybe it can. Again, I don't want to rely on rejecting it, but the way the debates went from there was those defending sort of serious metaphysics. People like Peter van Imwagen said, no, look, it's basically a kind of mathematical term. If there's one or more than X, then there are X's. You don't want to say one varies in meaning, do you? This is a sort of formal term, right? And then people like Ted Sider said, hey, look, even if there actually does vary in meaning in the mouths of the ontologists, we can reintroduce a unified meaning for there is by saying that all the disputants want to agree, let's agree hereby, that we're going to use there is with whatever the most metaphysically privileged meaning is, that which maps onto sort of the logical structure of the world. All right, so I talked some about that in Ontology Made Easy. Basically, I didn't want to engage in that kind of dispute. And I wanted to agree with Van Imwagen that there are some core formal rules of use for exists that make it interchangeable with number terms and so on. So what I wanted to do is to identify a way in which one could challenge these ontological debates that I think is closer to Carnap's original view and that remains available even if you don't think the quantifier does or could equally well vary in meaning. here's why I think you get something better out of it, right? A lot of people didn't like the verbal disputes idea because they said, hang on, usually if we have a verbal dispute, you can figure that out and I'll go home happy. If you and I are in a verbal dispute about whether I went to the bank today, eventually we'll figure out we meant different things. We can clarify our terms, we go home happy. This doesn't happen in the ontological debates, right? You can't just clarify to them, oh, look, you're using exists this way, you're using exists that way. You know, the person who denies numbers, you think that has to be causally relevant, you don't, and so we can just all go home happy. There isn't that sort of sense to them. So the sense that they're verbal disputes also sort of suggests that these are really just sort of shallow disputes about words that can just be resolved once we clarify our terminology, and most people think ontological disputes aren't like that. My view says, hang on, as long as we're all speaking English with the usual terms in the usual way, we might be, the person who says numbers exist, the person who says numbers don't exist, really disagreeing. They're not just talking past each other, right? But one of them is right and one of them is wrong, right? Then we can move to the external framework and say what's really going on here is a practical argument, as we've discussed, about whether we should adopt this kind of terminology, right? But we can see that as a really important worldly argument that's not just answered by figuring out what our words mean, and that it can explain the tenacity of some of these debates and their worldly relevance and so on in ways that I think aren't so easily done by a kind of verbal disputes view. So I've got a paper, Metaphysical Disputes and Metalinguistic Negotiation, where I try to work through, that came out after Ontology Made Easy, where I try to work through these differences between the verbal disputes view and the easy ontology view.
Okay, and we're back. Got interrupted for a moment there, but we're gonna continue where we left off. So Amie, you had just explained the quantifier variance view, the view that this is all just about verbal disputes, and why your view is different. So one thing it made me think to ask you actually is that I take it that under your view then, since this is not a verbal dispute, existence does have a correct meaning, a particular correct meaning. How would you describe it? Like if somebody were to ask you, according to an easy ontologist, what does existence actually mean? What would be your answer?
Oh, so I have this I think it's in the second chapter of Ontology Made Easy. Let's see if I can recreate it. So I do think that existence comes with a sort of fixed rule of use that marks its inferential role. I mean, if you'd like, you can take this as a proposal instead of a bit of explaining what the ordinary meaning already is. So I do think that we can get an inference that goes roughly like this. If the application conditions for a term, say T, whether it's cat or desk or whatever, the actual application conditions for that term are fulfilled, then we're entitled to say cat. Think about how we actually use existence claims in ordinary language. Actually, we more naturally use non-existence claims. If someone's telling you, if a child tells you that they hope Santa Claus comes on Christmas, you might correct them and say, Santa Claus doesn't exist, right? And part of what you're doing there, I think, is as a way of showing that there's a problem with their use of the word. They've assumed it traces back to a person, really it just traces back to these stories, and so on. So I think of then the function of existence claims as a way of endorsing or criticizing certain word uses as being ill-grounded or confirming them as well-grounded. And I think one rule of use for exists takes us from the application conditions for the term are fulfilled to these things exist. There's also other inferential roles, like if P's exist, then we can say there are P's, for example, and we can say there is at least one P, and so on. So I think of it as a term with a kind of fixed formal inferential role in these ways. I don't think of it as having its meaning given to it by some property of existence in the world.
Would you say, though, that given everything you just said, that it could be characterized by the property of satisfying application conditions?
So I think that's pretty close to my view. I just want to be a little careful how I state it, because what you can say is that the application conditions for a word are satisfied by the world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if you've got that, then you can say that the thing exists,
Mm-hmm.
right? So since application conditions are at the level of words and existence is at the level of world, you have to be a little bit careful about this. But I think there is this sort of license to move up and down from talking about words, talking about the world. Just like you can move up and down from saying snow is white to it's true that snow is white, not talking about the sentence.
Okay, that makes sense. So, want to switch gears a little bit. So, it seems like part of the value of easy ontology is that it gives us pretty easy answers to some things that we thought we knew the answers about anyway, like the fact that desks and chairs exist and numbers exist and all that. It would seem to also, however, give us a positive answer to the existence of some things that maybe we didn't think necessarily existed, such as, for example, mereological sums. Those are at least, let's say, at least controversial regarding the intuition about whether they should exist or not. So, from that might stem a criticism that says that easy ontology is kind of bloated, actually gives us the objects we wanted, but also gives us some objects that we did not want. What is your response to that line of objection?
Yeah, good. That is a really common line of objection. It's something that divides, say, Dan Corman from myself on matters of ontology. So I like the way you phrase it, right? You said it also gives us some things that we didn't think existed, like mereological sums. And the usual bad examples are things like the sum of the front half of a trout and the back half of a turkey, or my nose in the Eiffel Tower, these kind of crazy things, right? And notice there's two different things you could say. You could say we didn't think those things existed, which I think is true, or we think those things didn't exist, right? And I think the way you put it is the natural and right way to put it, because the truth of the matter is normal people don't think about these things, right? We don't think about trout turkeys or about combinations of my nose and the Eiffel Tower. It's not that we have a sort of preceding belief that they don't exist. So a couple of lines of response to this kind of criticism. One is to say, yeah, we didn't think they existed because we didn't think about them. We weren't introduced to the language of mereological sums. But once you're introduced, if you know the rule of use is this, if you've got A and you've got B, then you're entitled to say you've got the sum of A and B. Then, of course, we should say there are such things once you've got that language in place. Well, why the intuitions on the other side? Because as you said, we have these kinds of conflicting intuitions about it, or it's a kind of controversial matter. Couple things to say there. One is, it sounds bad if you start to say, as my opponents generally say, things like, oh, so you think there's such an object as my nose in the Eiffel Tower, right? And that sounds weird, right? But the reason that sounds weird, and this is something I try to diagnose in ordinary objects, I've got it now, is that we have a couple of different uses of object or thing in English. One of them is a word for roughly a medium-sized, unified, connected bunch of stuff, right? That's sort of separately mobile from the rest. And of course, there's no object in that sense that is my nose and the Eiffel Tower. They're not glued together. They don't move together, right? But that doesn't show that there's not a mereological sum, only that mereological sums aren't always unified objects in this sense of object, the sort of sortal sense. So that explains some of the intuitions. The other thing I talked about a little bit earlier is there's a difference between reading these sort of as internal questions and external questions. So as soon as you put the mereological sum question as an internal question, here's the language, here's its rules, here's its use, then I think you get the easy answer, yeah, there are sums. But there's still the interesting external question. Should we adopt this language? Right? And then I think we really have to start by asking the question, what for? What do we want it for? And I think some of the intuitions that say, no, there aren't such things, are not so much intuitions that there's no such thing as the sum of my nose in the Eiffel Tower, but that's stupid.
Something like there's no use in talking about such a thing.
Precisely. There's no use in talking about such a thing. And so again, I think I've talked to other philosophers, talked to their students who basically come back with the it's stupid view more than the I understand the language, but I believe that they don't exist view. And if you look at the history of it too, I mean, the language of mereological sums was introduced in order to provide a sort of nominalistically acceptable alternative to talking about sets for people who didn't want to accept that sets exist because they don't want to accept abstract entities. But if you accept easy ontology, you see there's not really a problem with accepting sets, and we don't really have a use for this alternative terminology, which makes things much more complicated. So I think there's very live questions about whether it's worth accepting a language of mereological sums, what it could possibly be for, what function it could serve for us. Till we answer that, we might have reason to reject all that discourse. But if you accept the discourse, then I think you get reason to accept the sums. So that's how I have a couple different ways then of trying to account for these feelings on the other side that there's something wrong or weird or stupid about saying that there are mereological sums.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like if in a way, the question is the application conditions about mereological sums. Is there ever a reason to actually use those? But assuming that we are actually using them, that we are admitting that we can talk about them, then again, it's just a question of looking at the world. Are there things that satisfy those conditions? And if the answer is yes, then the answer is yes.
That's it exactly. So if the application conditions are fulfilled, yeah, there are. Why would you want to say that? Well, I don't know. Let's talk. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So another question. Going back to some of those ideas that people have presented about what might be the essential criteria for existence, causal, power, and all of those. Do you now have to say that in some cases there will be things that exist that don't have some of those? So, for example, I suppose now, based on easy ontology, there will be some things that exist that maybe don't have mind independence or that don't have distinctive causal power. Tables and chairs have causal power, and so do their sort of particles that make them up. So now that causal power has that redundancy issue, do you kind of have to just bite the bullet on, look, some types of things just don't meet those criteria?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to me, that's kind of the right result anyway. Certainly we talk as if normally there are things that are mind dependent, like, contracts and marriages and all these sort of social entities, right? Even the causal powers issue, I mean, it's always seemed to me quite question-begging. If you wanted to argue against the existence of numbers by saying to exist you have to have causal powers, I just asserted that, but numbers don't. It's like, hey, if you expected numbers to have causal powers, you were kind of confused about what numbers are supposed to be anyway. Mm-hmm. So it just begs the question against them to adhere to this generalized criterion. So I totally reject those generalized criteria for exactly that kind of reason. And I think that also enables us to better capture the kinds of existence claims we want to make, which is, some marriages exist and some are fakes, and some contracts exist and some were never signed, and so on. So we do want to make existence and non-existence claims also with regard to things that are, if they exist at all, clearly mind dependent or lack causal powers in other cases.
If anything, that would seem to open up the opportunity for something like a taxonomy of types of things that exist. Presumably there are sort of like distinct types of things that do have distinctive causal power or do have mind independence, but just not all of the things that exist. So that kind of opens up the possibility for, here are these types of things that exist and here are these types of things that exist.
Absolutely. And I do something like that way back in my first book, sort of towards the end of Fiction and Metaphysics. And I come up with a range of categories based on things like their dependencies on minds and on the spatiotemporal realm. And it yields, I think it was 100 categories. These days, I would start probably more from the linguistic mode and say, well, let's start by talking about the functions language can serve. And some of those are going to end up referring to things without causal powers or things that are mind dependent and so on. But yeah, absolutely. If you talk in the ontological mode, you end up with this range of different categories that have different characteristics. And it's not always going to be that they'll meet any of these standard uniform criteria of existence.
Right. So I've been really fascinated with the sorites paradox for a good while. It's kind of one of my favorite topics in philosophy, and I find that the problem of the sorites paradox and of vagueness generally, I've always found it to be a pretty serious challenge to pretty much any kind of ontology that I've encountered. How does easy ontology have a way of dealing with the distinct challenge that vagueness poses?
So in ordinary objects, I argue that this approach at least gives us both a distinct way of understanding the source of vagueness and also of understanding what it is to say there's vagueness in the world and why it's not problematic. So if you think about, for me, the way we answer existence questions, as you know, comes from figuring out the application conditions and whether or not they're fulfilled, right? And at least some of the sorites cases take the form of existence questions, right? You've got a table with n million atoms, and then if you remove one atom from anything that's a table, then it's still a table, and then you end up with a one-atom table, right? Then one way we can identify the source of vagueness is in the vagueness of our application conditions, right? Application conditions are fixed by us. As you said earlier in the interview, sometimes we stipulate the definitions for our new terms, but for natural language terms, we have this sort of also higher order vagueness, that it's sort of vague what's going to count, how many people have to feel tied to the norm of using a word this way for it to count as the meaning. That's itself a vague matter, right? So we have this phenomenon that, first of all, the application conditions themselves can be vague or indeterminate in various ways. Secondly, we've got this sort of higher order vagueness of what does it take for this to be the application conditions of a shared natural language term, right? So that can explain why we get this kind of phenomenon, right? I argue in ordinary objects, and I won't go through all the details because it gets kind of technical. It would be a bit of a long sidetrack, that you can use either like a sort of tie-style three-valued logic or a sort of supervaluational approach to do a kind of formal modeling of it that's perfectly consistent with everything I say, and there's no need to take a stand. But I'm inclined to think that in the sorites, the premise to go is the one that says, if you have a table, then removing one more atom from it will always yield you a table, and to treat that as indeterminate but never false in its truth value, which blocks the inference.
So get rid of the tolerance principle, right? That says that actually says that there's okay.
Exactly. And then the other thing is, right, a lot of people are worried about this because they say, well, there can't be vagueness in the world. If there's any vagueness, it's got to be in our representations, not in the world itself. And there I try to discuss how, and again, this fits even better with the easy ontology than what I had going in ordinary objects explicitly. You can see there as being a sort of anodyne sense of vagueness in the world that just comes from these trivial inferences, right? So if you can say, for example, that it's indeterminate whether it's true that the table still exists, then you could say it's indeterminate whether the table exists, and you can say the table is such that it's indeterminate whether it exists in this particular circumstance, right? Or it's indeterminate whether our term mountain extends, or Mount Everest extends this far or this far on the map, and then you can just sort of transform that to saying, so Mount Everest is such that it's indeterminate with respect to its boundaries. And this is still a vagueness. It's a vagueness in the world because it's about Mount Everest or about the desk or whatever. But it's a vagueness in the world that is a reflection of the vagueness in our terms, because that's the only way we have of talking about the world and representing the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Sorry?
Good.
It always seemed to me that, I've encountered this fear that we're going to have to acknowledge vagueness in the world, and there's something wrong with that. But yeah, it has always seemed to me that even if we have to accept that there is vagueness in the real objects of the world, that's only insofar as the objects that we're referring to with our words, and that if those words are vague, then those objects will come out as vague. But we're not that doesn't mean that, I feel like, it's kind of like what we were saying earlier about how people might have some kind of expectation that the existence of universals might be this like ethereal thing. Similarly, I think vagueness in the world sounds like, do you mean that like stuff itself is somehow kind of vague? And it's not quite that. It's just that we can only talk about the things we have words for. And if those are vague, then the stuff we're talking about is vague.
Exactly. Yeah. And as you say, it's hard to see what else it would even mean for there to be vagueness in the world.
Right. I think sometimes people just kind of maybe picture fuzzy objects,
Right, right. And of course, there's some of those, but that's
Right.
fuzzy in a different sense. Yeah.
So, okay, so let's say that we accept easy ontology. What is left? So what kinds of, are there any ontological questions that are still hard? So easy ontology gives us this method, right? Look to, well, but you're still going to need some kind of empirical and conceptual work.
Right.
Are there any questions that seem to you that would still be difficult, would still require a great deal of debate, given the, let's say, the conceptual work involved? Because if there's empirical work involved, then maybe that's really not a philosophically interesting matter. But let's say conceptual work.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, things still can be difficult in the ordinary sense, not in my technical sense of requiring nothing but conceptual and empirical work. But as you say, obviously empirical work can be hard. That's mostly for the scientists. Conceptual work can be really hard too. I mean, I think a lot of there's two kinds of conceptual work for me. There's like conceptual analysis, trying to figure out how our actual conceptual scheme works. And then there's pragmatic conceptual work, conceptual ethics, conceptual engineering, how ought it to work. Let's start with the first side, right? Look at our concept of freedom, right? What is involved in our concept of freedom? Does it just require that we be unconstrained in certain ways, or does it require failures of determinism or something like agent causation, right? I mean, this is really difficult work and it's really a large part of what the free will debate has been focused on for hundreds of years. That remains really difficult. There's also sort of global conceptual analytic questions that are really difficult. Questions about how our conceptual scheme as a whole fits together, like Strawson was involved in, or even Kant for that matter, right? Are there sort of essential elements of our conceptual scheme or of any conceptual scheme that could count, right? What are the sort of basic categories of our conceptual scheme and how do they fit together? All these sort of structural questions are very difficult and very interesting questions in conceptual analysis. But then beyond both of those, I think, are the even more interesting to me questions about conceptual ethics and conceptual engineering. What ought we to do with our concepts, right? What concept of freedom ought we to adopt? Never mind how our actual one works, or maybe there's some implicit contradictions in it. What should we do with that? Or take the concept of art, right? A huge mess, probably, if you're trying to just do it in conceptual analysis, and one that at various times in art history has proven inadequate to what artists were doing. Mm-hmm. So what should we do with it, right? And there were times when philosophers like Clive Bell moved the concept of art from a representational concept to a concept that tied it to form, or others later to expression. And these kinds of questions of conceptual negotiation, I think, are sort of the most interesting ones. They also involve things like what should we do with our race terms and gender terms, right? And even the most abstract questions of metaphysics, like what's an event? Right? I mean, this can really involve a kind of conceptual negotiation. How should we individuate events that can have real world consequences? I mean, there were billions of dollars at stake after 9/11 in determining whether the falling of the Twin Towers was one event or two. Right? So there's these issues in conceptual negotiation that I think are the most interesting and contested and difficult, and that really matter to our lives, and that really matter in worldly ways. How we understand disability, for example, also. How we should understand species. What species terms should we have? How should we define them? How do they relate to what biologists are doing? Right? All these, to me, are questions in conceptual ethics and conceptual engineering. And to me, that's where the most interesting and difficult philosophical work to be done is. Doesn't mean we philosophers do it on our own. We can do it hand in hand with lawyers, biologists, whoever has use for these concepts.
That's interesting. It sounds like you seem to approach what you've done as kind of clearing up a kind of metaontological debate that will allow us to actually carry out maybe ontology itself, and in a way that focuses on, I guess, on what you described as what Carnap saw as the way we can interpret those external questions, which
exactly.
is what's the pragmatics here of how we should be talking.
Exactly. And that's sort of where I've gone since Ontology Made Easy came out, because a lot of people looked at it and said, okay, but doesn't that make these ontological debates too easy? How can you account for the apparent depth and difficulty and worldliness of the debates that have gone on. Maybe some contemporary debates about mereological sums or whatever are stupid, but take debates about freedom, for example, or art or something like that. So what I've really been doing since then is bringing out this other side of the pragmatic side that comes with what I've called external questions, and trying to show how there's room for reconceiving of the proper work of metaphysics, as well as a lot of what it really has done behind the scenes in a lot of the best historical work, how to reconceive that as engaged in pragmatic work of deciding what concepts we should use and how we should use them, and why that can be of worldly importance, not just language games and playing with words, but of real worldly importance, as well as difficult and having relevance for how we live and what we do.
So that segues really well into the last thing I wanted to ask you, which is related to your current work. So could you say just a bit more about that? Where, following in now this question about sort of the pragmatic attitude about how to delineate our concepts, where, you know, what approach are you finding in that project, and where is it taking you so far?
Yeah, so that project, I've been doing a sort of series of papers on conceptual ethics and conceptual engineering. It started off with this paper, Metaphysical Disputes and Metalinguistic Negotiation, in which I argue that a lot of what look like first-order worldly debates can really turn out to be, on closer examination, ways people have of pressing for what language or concept we should use by using those terms. And that can explain why ontology is usually done straightforward in worldly terms, not looking like we're talking about language or concepts, and why it has worldly relevance. So that's, for example, here's a regular metalinguistic negotiation, right? This is an example from Peter Ludlow that's brought up by David Plunkett and Tim Sundell. Debates about whether the racehorse secretariat is an athlete, right? You can imagine people agree on all the facts about what races Secretariat won and how he trained and all that. And one says he's an athlete and the other says he's not, right? And they're not really disagreeing about any of the facts. What they're doing is lobbying for whether or not athlete is a term that should be usable to apply to non-human animals, right? So that paper, I argue that we can use this model to understand what's going on in a lot of philosophical disputes, even traditional ones about free will or about art, whatever, when someone says that abstract painting is art and someone else said it's not, right? Or Hume says that action is free and a libertarian says that action is not free, right? And then since then, I've been trying to sort of step back to engage in the more theoretical issues about how this kind of work should be done. Well, what are the criteria if we're going to be engaging in metaphysics in conceptual choice and choosing what concepts we should use and how we should use them? What are the standards we should use in making those choices? Is there a way that we can evaluate some conceptual decisions as better or worse, and do that without appealing to hard metaphysics, without saying, oh yeah, it's better because it maps the way the world really is metaphysically speaking, right? So I've been trying to develop this pragmatic method for conceptual ethics that shows how we can make these choices on pragmatic grounds. And I think that's also very Carnapian in spirit. So that's kind of what I've been up to from there. Then that'll, of course, open further issues about what view of concepts is needed to think this kind of conceptual change is possible, how you can actually get this kind of conceptual change to be enacted in the real world, right, as opposed to just by philosophers, what role philosophers, as opposed to people like lawyers or public speakers or whatever, can really play in making this kind of conceptual change. So eventually, that'll probably be another book of its own. I've got a series of a few papers so far to draw on where I really try to promote this way of reconceiving of metaphysics as a way of preserving its importance, depth, and worldliness without the epistemological mysteries, without the kind of skepticism that can go along with traditional metaphysics.
It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like you're using some of that kind of theory choice style of thinking, but applying it to linguistic frameworks as opposed to metaphysics.
Yeah, I think in a sense, yes. I mean, so this is the way in which, again, I'm sort of harkening back to Carnap rather than Quine, because Carnap talked about linguistic frameworks and our choice of these frameworks, and because Quine rejected the difference between analytic and synthetic propositions, right? He rejected this talk of mere linguistic frameworks and thought of it all as a theory that mixed in the analytic and the empirical. Mm-hmm. So I want to go back and say, no, wait, we can think about the words and concepts we use separately from the question of whether things we state using them are true.
Right.
And what we should do in part then is go back and ask what the function is of the concepts and terms we introduce. If this is the function we should be serving, if so, how would it best be served? I want a model that really thinks of language as a kind of tool that can be evaluated for its function like other tools.
Fantastic. Well, Amie, thank you so much. This discussion has been terrific. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much for letting me talk with you and for your interest in my work.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.